Welcome back to the YouTube channel of the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we're delving deeper into the profound insights of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support means the world to us. We kindly ask you to like and share this audiobook, thus expanding its reach and allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you receive immediate notifications when new content is uploaded. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, cultivating a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner tranquility. We are sincerely grateful for your involvement in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. Let's now begin today's reading. The Noble Truths Come First. March 20, 2017. We meditate because there's stress in our lives. The word stress here translates the Pali term, dukkha, which can mean anything from very subtle levels of stress, all the way to very deep suffering. So whether we feel a lot of suffering in our lives or just a little bit of stress, however you translate the term, that's the problem that makes us want to come and meditate, to straighten out things inside. As the Buddha said, the reason we suffer is not because of uncomfortable or unpleasant things outside. Sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations. It's because of what we bring to these things from the inside. That's why we can suffer even from pleasant things. We suffer, we feel stress, because we cling. In fact, the clinging is the suffering. The word clinging, upadana, can also mean feeding. We feed on things. And here the word feeding, of course, means not just physical feeding, but also mental and emotional feeding. To be in a position where you have to feed is a very unstable position. You always have to worry about your source of food. That's why clinging feeding is suffering in and of itself. The mind has a sense of lack. Because of the lack, it wants to fill it up. You fill it up a little bit, and then it grows empty again. Our intestinal system, for instance, is not a sack. It's a tube. Whatever comes in, goes out. And the same with the mind's intestinal system. Things come in and give us a little bit of pleasure, and then the pleasure's gone. We want something new, something new, something new all the time. So it's a bad position to be in, having to feed. Because we identify ourselves as a being of one kind or another, that being has to feed. And then the feeding, of course, creates our sense of who we are. The way we feed, what we feed on. It's a vicious cycle. We meditate to get out of this. We're going to work directly on our minds, because the problem is in the mind. It's not out there. So focus on what your mind is doing. See if you can bring the mind to a state of stillness, so that you can have a sense of satisfaction being here. One of the reasons we feel so hungry for everything and so overwhelmed by all the choices out there, is that we have this limitless sense of dissatisfaction inside. As the Buddha said, even if it rained gold coins, it wouldn't satisfy our desires for sensuality. And that covers just one kind of desire. There are lots of other desires we have, lots of other hungers we have. So try to get a sense of satisfaction in being right here. All of what we're doing here falls under the Four Noble Truths. We see that there's suffering and that its cause is in the mind. And the solution has to lie in the mind as well. It's always important to remember that the Four Noble Truths form the framework for right view, in other words, the right understanding about what we're doing. This is a point that a lot of people miss. For most people, the three characteristics are right view. That's the framework, and then the Four Noble Truths get interpreted inside that framework. In other words, they say that we suffer because we don't realize that things are inconstant or impermanent, or because we don't realize that there's no self, which is one of the interpretations of anatta. If we'd only learned the truth of these things, then we wouldn't suffer anymore. We wouldn't have any unrealistic expectations, and we'd be content to just accept the way things are. That's what they say, but that wouldn't satisfy the mind's hungers. The mind is hungry. If you could let go of your clinging and craving simply by seeing that things are inconstant, stressful, and not self, it would be like saying that because food is inconstant, stressful, and not self, and your stomach is inconstant, stressful, and not self, You're going to content yourself with not eating anymore. If you actually tried that, you'd starve. Or before you starve to death, you'd probably say, enough of that, and go back to eating again. That's the way the mind works. No matter how much you tell yourself that these things out there are not satisfactory, you say, well, that's all I've got. And sometimes that's how Buddhist wisdom is interpreted. A willingness to accept that, well, this is all we've got, so let's satisfy ourselves with what we've got. But the Buddha realized that the hungers of the mind, and the damage they cause, run a lot deeper than that. So instead of placing the 3 characteristics first, he put the 4 noble truths first, and then the 3 characteristics which are actually not really characteristics. He called them perceptions, find their role within the framework of the 4 noble truths, and the duties appropriate to each. You've got to comprehend suffering. You've got to abandon its cause. You've got to realize the cessation of suffering. And then you've got to develop the path to its cessation. These are duties we have to do, duties not in the sense of being imposed on us from outside, but duties that are simply built into the way things are, the way suffering works, and the way its end is going to work. If you want to put an end to suffering, this is what you've got to do. If you don't want to put an end to suffering, you're free to go anywhere and do anything you like. But suffering is still eating away at you, so when you've had enough of it, there's no other way to solve the problem aside from following these duties. The first 3 duties revolve around dispassion. In other words, to comprehend suffering is to see exactly what is the clinging that constitutes the suffering. And why do we like that clinging? We're feeding. We feel that we get our satisfaction out of feeding, but the Buddha wants you to see that there's suffering inherent in the feeding and to really comprehend that suffering to the point where you feel dispassion for the whole process. Then you look for why you're clinging. It's because you're thirsty. You crave. That's what you've got to abandon, which, again, you do by developing dispassion for the craving. That's what brings about the cessation of suffering. The dispassion itself is what puts an end to suffering. And how are you going to bring that about? Through developing the path. The path does this by giving you an alternative source of food. The pleasure, the rapture, the sense of fullness, the refreshment that can come from getting the mind into concentration. You want to be able to tap into this refreshment because it's going to be your food on the path. And this is the one duty that doesn't immediately have to do with dispassion. In fact, you've first got to have some passion for your concentration. You want dispassion for the craving. You want dispassion for the objects that you cling to. That dispassion is the 3rd noble truth. But to see these things so that you can develop dispassion in those ways means that you've first got to have passion for the path. This is one case where you're not going to just say, my concentration is inconstant, stressful, not self. I'll let it go. You're actually fighting against those 3 perceptions. You want to make the mind as constant and as easeful and as much in your control as you can. And, at this stage of the path, you apply those 3 perceptions to other things. Anything that would pull you away from the practice of virtue, the practice of concentration, or the practice of discernment. You see those distractions as inconstant, stressful, not self. These perceptions are there to develop a sense of dispassion for them. It's only when the path has really completed its work, in other words, it's fully developed, that you then let that go, too. Then you apply the perceptions to the concentration itself. When you can let go of the concentration, along with the other factors of the path, you go beyond them to what the Buddha calls the property of the deathless. And if you have passion for that, you don't get fully awakened. But the fact that you've touched it means that you're awakened to some extent. This is where it's important to realize that the 3 characteristics, or the 3 perceptions, don't cover everything. In other words, this deathless is not inconstant and it's not stressful. But still, the Buddha says you've got to let go of it. That's why he says Sab Dhamma Anatta, not just Sabba Sankhara Anatta. Not just all fabrications, but all dhammas, all phenomena, fabricated or not self. That's the perception you apply to that experience. That's when you're totally free. You can develop dispassion for that, too. That may seem like a subtle issue. Which comes first, the Four Noble Truths or the three perceptions? It may sound like it's applicable only at the very end of the path, but it's important to keep this perspective in mind all along the way, for two reasons. The first is to remind yourself that the problem is not simply with the objects of your awareness. It's with how you relate to them. The second is that if you come up with anything that seems constant, seems permanent, like a ground of being of some kind, or some deep interconnectedness, a oneness, non-duality, you have to ask yourself, are you still clinging to it? If you're clinging to it, if there's any sense of identity in there at all, there's going to be suffering, no matter how constant the object may seem. The fact that you're in a position where you're trying to feed on it, that's where the suffering lies. So having these frameworks properly sorted out helps get you past those kinds of wrong release, as the Buddha would call them. In other words, you think you're released but you're not. You think you've reached something really permanent but you haven't. So this is your protection. Also, of course, there's the whole question of how to interpret those three perceptions, the tendency to make them metaphysical truths, i.e., characteristics of things as they are, especially if you get to the question of is there a self? Is there no self? The Buddha calls those questions a thicket of views, a wilderness of views, a contortion of views, a writhing of views. In other words, you get entangled in the brush and the thorns off to the side of the path. If we had to spend all our days arguing as to whether there is or isn't a self, we'd never be able to practice. We wouldn't have the time. We wouldn't have the opportunity. But if we see not self simply as a perception, a label that you apply to things when you need to develop dispassion for them, then not self, instead of being a thicket, is actually a machete for cutting through the thicket. It develops dispassion, and when the dispassion has done its work, you can put the labels down. There was a controversy years back in Thailand as to whether Nibbana was self or not self. The issue got so politicized that it made its way into the newspapers and on TV. So someone asked Ajahn Mahabua whether Nibbana was self or not self, and he answered, Nibbana is Nibbana. In other words, you don't apply either of those perceptions to Nibbana. It's something beyond. But that's because it is total dispassion. There's no clinging there at all. So the clinging is suffering, not because we cling to impermanent things, but because just the act of clinging in and of itself entails suffering. Keep that in mind because that's what we're working on as we practice. You're going to cling to the meditation. That's fine for the time being. Remember Ajahn Chah's example. Coming back from the market, you've got a banana in your hand, and someone asks you, why are you carrying the banana? You say, I want to eat it. Are you going to eat the peel, too? No. Then why are you carrying that? Ajahn Chah says, how are you going to answer them? As he said, you answer them out of desire, your desire to give the right answer. And that's what gives rise to the discernment that allows you to say, the time hasn't come to let go of the peel. If I let go of the peel now and held the banana flesh in my hand, it'd become mush. So you have some passion for your practice as you try, at the same time, to develop dispassion for things that would pull you away. You apply the three perceptions wherever you need to develop that sense of dispassion. When the path is fully developed, then you can foster dispassion for that, too. Because that's what we're working on. The way the mind relates to things, trying to feed on them all the time out of a sense of passion for them. We're such compulsive feeders that even when we have our first experience of the deathless, we're going to try to feed on that, too. We're like a little baby who crawls around and sees everything as stuff to put in his mouth. But when you find that there is something where there really is no clinging in it, there really is no sense of hunger, that's when you realize that the feeding was the problem all along. And that's when you can put everything down. So remember to keep the framework and the contents of the framework in the right order. The three perceptions are there just to help you within the framework of the duties of the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths come first because they alert you as to where the real problem is. If you keep your eyes on that, then it's hard to go wrong. The Power of Truth. May 23, 2016. One of the Buddha's insights is that truths don't just represent the way things are. In other words, they're not just an act of reporting. They also incite action. They have a power. Certain truths will make you do things, allow you to look at things in a certain way, which will then allow you or compel you to act. This is one of the reasons why the noble truths are noble, because they get you to act in a noble way. The Buddha wasn't interested in simply saying things that were true. As you may remember, his standard for the things he would say was that they be true, beneficial, and timely. The beneficial part had to do not only with the meaning of the words, but also with what they would get you to do. And this is one of the reasons why the two words, Dhamma and Atha, go together so often in the canon. Atha is not only the meaning of the words, but also the goal to which they aim, the profit and benefits they bring about. So when you ask about the Atha of a teaching, you're asking both about the meaning of the words and about where they lead, what their payoff is. What is this truth for? What good does it do? What does it lead you to do? Truths have power. They do lead in a certain direction. There are lots of true things you can say about reality that can actually be contradictory, or at least they sound contradictory. There are ways you can look at the aggregates and say that they're stressful, and yet the Buddha also admitted that there is pleasure in the aggregates. You can't say they're 100% stress. So, the question is then, which truth are you going to focus on? And that's answered by asking what the result is going to be. What is it going to get you to do? If you focus on how pleasant the aggregates are, you're going to hold on to them. If you focus on their stressful side, then you're going to do what you can so as not to be trapped by them. The noble truths are noble not only because they get you to do noble things, but also because they get you to a noble attainment. The Buddha talked about two kinds of searches in life. There's the search for happiness in things that will change. He said that there's nothing noble about that. And then there's the search for happiness in things that don't change, no aging, no illness, no death. That kind of search, he said, is noble. To help with that search, we look at things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. There are certain duties that go along with them, and when we fulfill those duties, they'll take us to something deathless. That experience of the deathless is what guarantees that they really are true, and really are noble. We might look at the truths, think about them, and decide that, yes, they seem reasonable. But as the Buddha said, just because something is reasonable doesn't mean that it really is true. The fact that they're reasonable simply aids in giving us confidence or conviction in their truth. That's one of his observations that go against our understanding in the West, that things like conviction or faith are opposed to reason. We have that belief because there's a major religion in our society that extols things you have to take on faith, even though they go contrary to reason. That's why we think that reason and faith are two radically different things. But, as the Buddha said, just because the Four Noble Truths seem reasonable, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're true. There has to be a further test. Their reasonableness is what gives you the faith and conviction that they're worth the test. If something doesn't make sense, if it contradicts itself, it doesn't really invite you to test whether it's true. But if something seems reasonable, it seems worthy of the test. So you put it to the test and you put yourself to the test, too, because these truths demand a lot of you. They demand that you look at your thoughts, your words, and your deeds, and particularly your thoughts, in a way that often will require you to let go of things you really like. That's because you learn how to look at the thoughts as part of a causal process. When you think in this particular way, where does it lead? When you think in a different way, where does it lead? This is what's special about the Noble Truths. They focus on this process of what the mind is doing with the truth. In this way, they contain the seeds for their own transcendence. There's a passage where Anathapindika is talking to a group of wanderers. He wanted to see the Buddha, but it was too early in the morning. The Buddha and the monks were out on their alms round, so he goes to talk to some wanderers instead. They ask him first off, what does the Buddha believe? What are his views? And it's interesting. Here's Anathapindika, who's a stream enterer by that time. He's already seen the deathless, And yet he says, I don't really know the extent of the Buddha's views, remembering, of course, that what the Buddha taught was just a handful of leaves, as opposed to the leaves of the forest, which were all the various types of knowledge he got in his awakening. So the wanderers ask him, in that case, what do you believe? What are your views? And he replies, I'll be happy to tell you my views, but first you tell me yours. And so the different groups have their different positions. Some say that the world is eternal. Some say it's not eternal. Some say it's finite. Some say it's infinite. The body is the same thing as the soul. The body is different from the soul. After the death of a Tathagata, you can say either that he exists, or he doesn't exist, or both, or neither. The standard list of positions on the hot philosophical issues of the day. As Anathapindika then points out, each particular view is stressful. It's inconstant, it's put together, and everything that's inconstant and put together is going to lead to stress if you hold on to it. So as you cling to that view, you cling to stress. After that, they say, okay, what's your view? And so he says, whatever is inconstant and put together is stressful. Whatever is stressful is not me, not myself, not what I am. They say, well, you're holding on to that. You're clinging to that. So you're going to suffer from that, too. He says, no, following this view, I see the escape from it. That's because it focuses you back on the process of how you relate to truths, and how you relate to your views, so it enables you to let go of it when you no longer need it, when it leads to nothing but stress. And in the letting go, that's when it leads to the deathless. So these are special views, and they're special because of their power. They lead you to a certain kind of action. They lead you to look at your own mind carefully. What are you doing? How do you relate to your thoughts, words, and deeds? How do you relate to your beliefs? How do you relate to your practices and all the things that we tend to cling to? What are the results of that clinging? How can you learn how not to cling to them? We need certain views, and we need certain habits and practices, and even certain assumptions about ourselves, in order to practice. But how do you use these things so they don't just keep you trapped? When they've done their work, how can you learn to let go? In the beginning, you learn not to pride yourself on your views or your habits. You don't brag about them, and you don't get into needless arguments with people about them, because when you get into arguments, there's always the question of who wins the arguments, and that leads to a certain amount of pride, and that pride will cause a problem. You get into arguments only when you see that there's a chance to correct a view that causes harm to the person holding it. So, avoiding needless arguments is, on the beginning level, how you begin to use these parts of the practice without being tied down to them, and without using them to create needless trouble for yourself. Remember the image of the snake. As the Buddha said, you try to grasp a snake, and if you grasp it wrongly, in other words, you grasp it by the tail, it's going to bite you. If you grasp it rightly, then it's not going to cause any trouble. You take a forked stick and you pin it down right behind its head. And no matter how much it may writhe around the stick, or even around your arm, it can't do you any harm. But notice, in both cases, you're holding the snake, but in one case you're holding it in a way that doesn't cause you any harm. The views are things that you have to hold on to, but you need to learn how to hold on to them properly. You hold to these truths in a proper way because they lead you to something beyond them if you're holding them properly. Some people would say, why not just avoid having any views at all? Well, that would be like not holding the snake at all. And if you don't hold the snake, how are you going to get the advantage that you can get from snakes? If you can get their venom, you can use it to create anti-venom. If you don't hold on to the snake at all, you're not going to get any benefit from it. So you do have to hold on. It's simply a question of how you hold on. You have to remember that you're holding on for the purpose of getting past suffering. That's what the Four Noble Truths all keep pointing to, simply laying things out. There's suffering and there is its cause. There's a cessation of suffering and there is a path to its cessation. The cessation is obviously where you want to go. In that way, the truths give you a goal, They give you an atha, a purpose. And they get you to act toward that purpose. That's their atha, too. That's the power of these truths. Then they reveal their power in being genuinely true and noble when they lead to a real experience of the deathless. When that comes, you naturally put them aside because you realize that talking about the deathless or having views about the deathless is one thing, but actually experiencing it is something else. The experience is what you're going for. And the experience is such that you don't need the words to stay with it. It stays on its own. So when you consider the various truths in the world, you'll notice that some have a lot of power, and some have very little power. Certain facts you can learn and they don't have any impact on your behavior. Those are things that are true, but not necessarily beneficial. Then there are certain truths that, if you act on them, are going to actually cause trouble. Those are not truths you want to get involved with in any way at all. What you want are truths that are true and beneficial and right for you at this time. And the noble truths, as the Buddha said, are categorically true. In other words, they are always true. They always apply to every situation. So learn how to apply them in the right way, so that they can really reveal their power, the power that makes them noble. To suffer is an active verb. August 22, 2018. When we say that we suffer, we usually think that we're on the passive receiving end of the suffering. It's something imposed on us, something to which we have to submit. In some of our more mature moments, we realize that there are times when we're adding to our own suffering, but we tend to see this more clearly in other people than we see it in ourselves. This is one of the reasons why, when we come to the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's analysis of suffering, we have to take them on faith because, in his analysis, to suffer is an active verb. It's something we're doing actively. It's a choice we make. It's a choice we make badly, out of ignorance. The suffering is in the activity of clinging. There was a scholarly book a while back that analyzed the Buddha's first noble truth, as if suffering were the 5 aggregates. The author went on to say that, because the 5 aggregates cover all of our experience, maybe the word dukkha doesn't mean suffering. Maybe it means experience. Other people have taken that idea and have run all over the place with it. But what the scholar said was not in line with what the Buddha said. Suffering, he said, is the 5 clinging aggregates. Where there are aggregates without clinging, say, in an arahant there's no suffering. Even when there's pain in the aggregates, the arahant's mind is in suffering. It's the act of clinging to these things, out of passion, out of delight in them because we find them alluring. That's the suffering. And it's something we're doing right now. This is one of the reasons why the Buddha doesn't have us try to go back into the past and ask, what did I do to deserve an illness, a mental state, a situation in life? He said that if you tried to trace all those things back, you'd go crazy. In fact, he said, you can't trace back and find a beginning point for the ignorance that underlies suffering. But you can see what you're doing to sustain it now. So we're not here to find the beginning points of these things. We're here to find out how we're sustaining them, how we keep them going. That's something we're doing in the present moment, which means it's something we can watch in action. This is one of the reasons why the quality of alertness and mindfulness practice is focused not on the present moment in general, on whatever happens to pop up in the present moment, but specifically on what you're doing and the results of what you're doing. That's where alertness is focused because that's where the problem lies and also where the potential for the solution lies. We look to see the level of suffering in the mind and then try to see how it's connected with what we're doing. The Buddha says to watch it to see it go up and down so that you can detect the causes. When are you going to watch it best? When you're getting the mind into concentration. That's when you're least distracted. You get the mind to settle down with a sense of well-being so that you become more sensitive to slight instances of stress or suffering. Then you try to notice them go up and down. When they go up, ask yourself, what did I do? When they go down, what did I do? Or what did I stop doing? That's how you're going to see the cause. At the same time, that's how you're going to see the allure. We don't think that we like to go for suffering, but suffering and pleasure are part and parcel of the same thing. Ajahn Chah's image is of a snake. You see that the snake has two ends. An end that has teeth and an end that doesn't have teeth. You figure that the end without teeth is a safe end to catch hold of, without realizing, of course, that the end without teeth is connected to the end with teeth. And the end with teeth will turn around and bite you. We grab after the aggregates. We grab after the allure of the aggregates. And they bite. The irony in all of this is that the aggregates themselves are things that we put together. We've got potentials coming in from the past for form, feelings, perceptions, fabrications, and consciousness. And then, for the sake of having aggregates to use, we fashion them, we put them together into actual aggregates. The Pali in this particular sutta is rather strange. It says that we do this for the sake of feelingness, for the sake of formness, for the sake of perceptionhood, and so on. It's a strange statement, but the important part of the statement is the for the sake of. We have a plan for these aggregates, maybe a confused and not very conscious plan, but we put them together for a purpose. We want some pleasure out of them. And in anticipation of the pleasure, we grab hold of them. We identify ourselves with our grabbing hold, with our feeding off of these things. Our fear is that if we stop feeding off these things, we won't be. We won't exist. So our very sense of who we are or what we are gets all tied up in our suffering, which makes it hard to separate these things out. It's like you're taking off your arm or your leg to examine it. This is why the analysis of your sense of self into a whole committee of selves is useful. You try to identify with the self that's doing the concentration. As for any other self that's going to come up and propose that you go off and enjoy some of the hindrances, you can disidentify with it. And then take it apart. Take off its arms and legs. Try to see. Where is the allure there? Why do I go for these things? And because the mind has many layers of deception, you're going to have to look at this again and again and again. Here, too, the approach of watching the level of stress go up and go down while you try to notice, what did I do just now? That's one of the ways in which you can pry these layers away. You're looking right at the moment when you're actually making the choice. If you looked at it a few seconds later, you might come up with another reason for why you did something. We're very good at making up reasons for why we do things, especially after the fact, so if you want to see through the make-believe, you've got to watch these things right as they're happening. What is the allure right now? When you really see it, you begin to realize that it's not really worth it. A sense of dismay arises. You realize how stupid you've been. This is when you develop a sense of disenchantment or nibbata. This word also means the feeling you have when you've been feeding on something and you suddenly realize that you've had enough. You really don't want it anymore. There's a touch of dismay there, but also a sense of sobering up because when you see the extent to which you're responsible for your own suffering, that's when you become mature. This is why one of the epithets for the Buddha was that he was exceedingly mature. He saw that suffering lies in what we're doing right now. It's not being imposed on us from outside. We're the ones who are actively going out and creating it, engaging in it, doing it. So when you see that this is an activity that's not worth it, you can drop it. That's how it's droppable. Because it's an activity. You simply learn how to stop doing it. If this sense of disenchantment goes deep enough, it's followed by dispassion. And dispassion is followed by release. You can stop the suffering because you can stop doing the suffering. And that's what counts. So when things come up in life, don't ask yourself, what karma did I do in the past that's making me suffer now? Or what is somebody else doing to me that's making me suffer? The question is, what am I doing right now? To what extent am I actively creating the suffering? To what extent can I see that it really is true that to suffer is an active verb, that it all comes from my own actions? When you see that, you also see the opportunity not to do those things anymore. You're not compelled to do them anymore. That's when you're free. As for where the outside conditions came from in the past, that's no longer an issue. The suffering you were creating moment to moment was the only suffering that was weighing down the mind. And now you've stopped. Rooted in desire. August 28, 2017. The Dhammapada starts with 2 verses on the topic of the power of the mind. The mind is the forerunner of all Dhammas. The mind is their chief, their mate of the mind. And we may say, on one level, that this sounds reasonable. The way you look at things, the way you act, will have an influence on what you experience. But it goes a lot deeper than that. Everything comes out of the mind. Everything you experience comes from the factor of fabrication and dependent co-arising, that's even prior to the experience of the 6 senses. We sometimes tend to think of the mind as being something passive, receiving input from outside and then responding in the old stimulus response mode. That only after the stimulus do we play a role in shaping things outside. But that view is much too passive. Things start with the movement of the mind outward. That's where all the trouble comes from, and so that's where the problem has to be solved. As the Buddha said, everything is rooted in desire. All Dhammas are rooted in desire. Everything, except Nibbana, is rooted in desire. You look at the 4 noble truths. The causal truths, i.e., the second truth and the fourth, the cause of suffering and the path to the cessation of suffering, are actions. There's the action of craving and clinging. There's the action of the desire and right effort. So the question is, which desires are you going to follow? And how deep does it go, this question of how the mind is shaping things? A lot deeper than you might think. This is why insight comes from asking questions about actions, because the results of actions are pleasure and pain. And the Buddha says, look at that pain. Where is it coming from? What's the cause? And he tells us to look into the mind for the cause. Of course, to deal with pain, we need to have a sense of pleasure someplace as our foundation, which is why we practice concentration. Right effort leads to right mindfulness. We're remembering to give rise to skillful qualities, and we're remembering to try to abandon unskillful ones. Right mindfulness then forms the theme around which right concentration develops. So this desire to put an end to suffering leads to mindfulness, and from there it leads to getting the mind to settle down and be really still in concentration with a sense of well-being, so that it can look at what else is going on at a deeper level. The greater the stillness of the mind, the more subtle the movements of the mind you'll be able to see. And you keep wanting to ask, is there any uptick in the level of stress? Any lowering of the level of stress? If you can catch that, you ask yourself then, what did I just do? What rose together with the stress? And what passed away together with the stress? This is why the cause of stress is called samudaya, something arising together, because, after all, part of your experience is based on past actions. And it's hard sometimes to see the relationship between a past action and a present one. As the Buddha said, the workings of karma are really complex. Sometimes an action may not date just from your last previous lifetime, but from lifetimes before that. How would you ever track that connection down? What you can track down is what you're doing right now. And as I said, independent co-arising, what you're doing right now, the fabrications that usually come out of ignorance come prior to input from the senses, even the 6th sense, i.e., the mind that's aware of ideas. So you're already shaping things before you have any input at all. What we're trying to do as we practice is to shape things with knowledge, with awareness, alertness. That's what the questions focusing on stress do, because otherwise you just go flowing through the various causal links in the chain, without paying much attention to what you're doing. It's become so natural that you don't see the extent to which you're fabricating things. Only when you ask questions do you begin to notice, oh, there was something happening there. I did this, and this resulted. So learning how to ask the right questions at the right time is an important part of gaining discernment. The Buddha said that it's a sign of people of discernment. How they approach a question, how they frame the question, how they apply it. His observation applies to the discernment. Related to understanding not only how to explain ideas and to ask questions about ideas you've heard explained, but also how to question the workings of your own mind. What are the perceptions that shape the way you're going about things? What are the assumptions? The assumption of self is a big one. The various perceptions about your relationship to the world. Those are also things you've got to learn how to question. And a good place to start is your relationship to your breath. How do you focus on the breath in a way that gives rise to well-being? How do you focus on it in a way that gives rise to stress? What's the difference? This is something we have to look at over and over and over again, because only when you've been over and over something many times do you see the details. Imagine these images of walking back and forth on a path. You see the little things on the side of the path you might not have noticed if you had walked down the path just once. The little changes. Certain plants are growing. Certain trees are dying. Certain flowers are blooming or wilting. Certain animals are crawling across the path or on the side of the path. If you're preoccupied with other things, you're not going to see these things no matter how many times you go back and forth. But if you're curious and observant, you'll see things on the side of the path that weren't there before. You'll notice something's changed. Something's up. In particular, you want to look at your actions. What are the desires underlying your actions? We all know that desires tend to be blind. How do you bring some vision to them, so that you see not only what you want to see, but also what's actually going on? The Buddha gives you lots of detailed instructions as to where to look, what kinds of questions to ask. Now, you may find that the particulars of your situation right now require slightly different questions that derive from the Buddha's basic ones. The trick lies in learning how to tweak them so they're just right for you. The point that doesn't change is that the questioning can't be done in the abstract. It has to be focused on what you're doing right here, right now, as you get the mind into concentration. That's the ideal action to look for, even when you're engaged with other themes of meditation aside from the breath. There should always be the question, what are you doing? And are the results consistent with what you've done before? When you're contemplating the body, the 32 parts, like we chanted just now, there are days when it's easy to visualize the different parts of the body and say, yeah, that's all there is to the body. Why are those days different from other days when you resist seeing the body as unattractive? Why is it so easy to shift back to your old perception that the body's something good-looking, something attractive? What was the desire that skewed your perceptions? This question focuses on a particular action, which is why the Buddha set the Four Noble Truths as his definition for right view, because as he said, the cause of suffering is an action. The path to the cessation of suffering is an action. This is to keep our minds always in that framework. The problem is that even in Buddhist circles, people shift away from that framework to a more passive view. A couple of months ago, when I was working on the book on the Noble Eightfold Path, I was reading other books explaining the Noble Eightfold Path. And I was struck by how many times the authors, when explaining right view, would make a brief mention of the Four Noble Truths, and then shift almost immediately to the three characteristics, saying that the Four Noble Truths are true because things are impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self. That's the reality out there, and we suffer because we cling to things that change. The implication here is that if we didn't cling, then we could still live with things that change, and there would be no problem. And on one level, that's true. But that assumption doesn't bring us to a place of real peace. To get to that place, you have to see that the things are changing because your desires are changing. It's not that you're sitting here just misunderstanding the nature of things and trying to force some permanence on things that won't be permanent. Any act of clinging is going to cause suffering. Even if you cling to the experience of the deathless, you're going to suffer. Another problem with basing right view on the three characteristics is that the implication is that if you don't resist change, then you'll be okay. You're told, just go with the flow. Don't have any fixed views. Allow everything to change. This idea is sometimes even used to justify changing the Dhamma. Of course, the Dhamma's going to change. But the Buddha didn't regard that as a positive thing. His image was of a drum. A crack develops in the drum, and so you place a peg in the crack. Another crack develops. You place another peg. Eventually, the whole drum is nothing but pegs. And it's not going to make the resonant sound the old drum made when it was one solid piece of wood. Changes in the Dhamma don't go in a good direction. So the Buddha's not simply saying, well, Learn how to accept change, and you'll be okay. He's saying, you're creating things that are changing. And then you're latching onto them. You're clinging to them. That's suffering. In fact, your clinging is creating things from which you suffer. So you've got to turn around and look at that action of clinging. And be sure to make use of the help that the Dhamma gives. Don't try to change the Dhamma, because otherwise it's not going to be as helpful to you. So remember, the basic framework is the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths start with actions. Our experience is all based on action. So whenever there's suffering, you ask yourself, what are the actions leading to that? Get the mind still enough so that it can see and know where to look. The problem isn't out there with the world. The problem is in here. We play a role in creating our experience, and then we forget about it. And then we blame the experience. So turn around. Look at the part of the mind that's constantly fabricating things in ignorance, under the force of desire. Bring some knowledge there through your questions, through your mindfulness and alertness and all the other good qualities you're trying to develop in the concentration. That's when you get to the root of the matter. Then when you get to the root, everything falls apart. But it doesn't fall apart in a bad way. It opens up to something that's unfabricated, that won't change. When there's no desire to create dhammas, we open to the end of dhammas, where there's no clinging, no suffering at all. It's like finding the right key and putting it in the right keyhole to unlock things, so that everything good will open up. The core of experience. September 24, 2017. When I was up in the Bay Area last week, I came across a new word. Corelessness. Apparently, the latest fashion is to claim that the Buddha said we are coreless, and that that's the meaning of anatta. In other words, there's a jumble of karmic activities that make up a human being. That's what you are. The anatta teaching, in this interpretation, is not a not-self teaching, it's a no-self teaching. It answers the question of what you are, saying that what you are has no core. You're like a karmic fuzz ball. All the fuzz that's picked up as the fuzz ball moves across the floor under the force of the wind is held together only by static electricity, but there's no real core there. This is supposed to represent what the Buddha taught about what we are. The problem is that the Buddha never talked about what we are. That was one of the questions he consistently avoided. If you say that there's no core there, then when karma ends in the attainment of nibbana, there'd be nothing left. Nothing would exist there. And the Buddha wouldn't have gone to such trouble to say that an arahant after death can't be said to exist or not exist or both or neither. It would be obvious. The arahant wouldn't exist. End of problem. But that wasn't his solution to the question. And it's no solution to anything at all. The Buddha was wise enough to see that however you define yourself, you limit yourself. So he wasn't concerned with limiting us or defining us. He wanted to help us find an unlimited happiness, because that was his main purpose. To show us, not what we are, but exactly how far the quest for true happiness can go. What kind of happiness is really worth the effort put into it? Is there a happiness that doesn't change? Something that, once you attain it, isn't going to turn on you? And he found that such a happiness does exist. It's the happiness of release, which he actually said is the core of all experience. All dhammas, he said, have release as their core. For core he used the word sara, the heartwood of a tree. But that's what it basically means. Essence, core. Release is the only core to be found in experience, but there is a core there. If there were no core at all, we'd just be floating around with nothing of any real solid importance to us or anybody else. It would be a miserable world. And you'd say, well, people can just go and do what they want, because there's nothing really there that genuinely matters. But, as the Buddha said, suffering matters. Happiness matters. And you'd think that, given the fact that such a happiness is available, people would want it. Yet, for most people, when they search for happiness, they look around and ask, well, who's doing something that looks like it might make them happy? Or who looks attractive? Or who looks interesting? And they take those people as their models without really stopping to examine carefully. Are those people really happy? And if a solid happiness is possible, why do we content ourselves with lesser things? So there is a core to experience, and it is a challenge, which may be another reason why people don't like to think about it. It forces them to change their ways too much. But you have to ask yourself, are you serious about being happy? And serious here doesn't mean grim, but simply sincere. Do you sincerely want to be happy? Do you want to take your desire for happiness as something important? For the Buddha, that's the beginning of wisdom and discernment. Taking your desire for true happiness as having essential value. And then, from the assumption, discernment develops. It develops through asking the question, what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? That's the question that lies at the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of discernment. It's wise first because it realizes that happiness is something that comes from your actions. It doesn't depend on who you are. Second, there is such a thing as long-term happiness. There are forms of happiness that don't simply come and go in an instant. And third, long-term is better than short-term. The Buddha's question here underlies the practice of what's called merit. Doing good things, being generous, being virtuous, having the restraint of goodwill for everybody. It's interesting that goodwill is regarded as a restraint. It basically holds your actions in check, the actions that would be harmful. What's unlimited about goodwill, of course, is that you extend it to everyone. But then the Buddha goes beyond those practices because, as he said, on their own, they don't lead ultimately to nibbana. They don't lead to release. You're looking for a happiness that's more than just long-term. You're looking for a happiness outside of time entirely, so that time cannot touch it. That's the core we're looking for. This is where the Buddha expands on that question on discernment through the questions about inconstancy, stress, and not self. If we're looking for something that's really beyond time, then it can't be inconstant. If it's true happiness, it can't be stressful. And if it's anything less than that, you don't want to hold on to it as self. You don't even want to hold on to release as self, because the idea of self implies clinging, and clinging stands in the way. So we take the issues of my long-term welfare and happiness and translate them into the questions on the three characteristics, or, rather, the three perceptions. Long-term corresponds to the question about inconstancy. Happiness corresponds to the question on stress. And my, of course, corresponds to the question on self or not self. So when you encounter things on the path of your practice, ask yourself, is this constant or inconstant? If it's inconstant, it's stressful and it's not self, then it's nothing you'd want to hold on to. It's not the core you're looking for. Now, you will find, though, that in the course of the path, there are certain things you do have to hold on to temporarily or provisionally, things like virtue, concentration, and discernment. Those are the skills you need to develop to get to release. After all, you can't use release to get to release. You have to use what you've got. And the things you've got form, feelings, perceptions, fabrications, and consciousness. What the Buddha calls the five aggregates are things that if you simply cling to them, are going to cause problems, going to cause suffering. In fact, the clinging will be suffering. But you can turn them into a path, which switches their role as part of the first noble truth about suffering to part of the fourth, the path to the end of suffering. Like you're doing right now. You've got your body sitting here, which is form. You're holding on to the perception of the breath to give rise to a feeling of ease. You're talking to yourself about the breath. That's fabrication. And your consciousness is aware of all these things. This is how you take the five aggregates and make them a path. Those are some of the things you hold on to provisionally as part of the Buddha's strategy. But whatever comes up in the course of your meditation, if you want to test to see whether it's the ultimate goal, you pull out those three questions. Is it constant or inconstant? Stressful or not stressful? And then if it's stressful and inconstant, is it worth holding on to, worth claiming as you or yours? These questions are your touchstone to find out what really is gold in here, what really is of solid value. Because there is something of solid value. The happiness that the Buddha points to has a solid value. It's something of infinite worth. And it can be touched inside. So we, as human beings, have this potential. Other human beings have this potential too, which is why we want to respect them. This connects with the fact that the Buddha never says that we're coreless. He doesn't say what we are, but he does say we have the potential to find a deathless happiness. It's there. And it's the core, the most valuable part of all experience. So keep that in mind as you practice. The question is always, what am I doing? What are the results I'm getting from my actions, and are they up to standard? You want to make the Buddha's standards the ones by which you measure things if you're really sincere about your happiness. Because that's what it comes down to. The level of your own sincerity. As the Buddha said, one of the treasures of the mind is atapa, compunction, which is the opposite of apathy. Apathy says, well, I'll do what I want and I don't care about the results. Compunction places all the importance on the results, regardless of whether an action is something you like or dislike. The issue isn't whether you like the causes, the issue is whether the results are worth the effort. In other words, you focus on what does this action lead to? The treasure of compunction is something the Buddha encourages us to develop within us, so that we can find the happiness he found in the same way that he found it. By looking inside and seeing that there is a core in here, not something you would say is you or yours. But it's a core and it's there. And that's what gives value to everything else. 191. Self-view and conceit. May 26, 2017. We read about the various fetters that are abandoned in the practice, and there's a temptation to want to reason our way past them, but that's not how the practice works. It works by a process of cause and effect. The fetters are abandoned as the effect of the practice, and not the effect of reasoning things through. We practice virtue, concentration, and discernment, and they, in turn, are dependent on developing certain factors like heedfulness, conviction, and desire. After all, the path itself needs to be put together. It's a fabricated thing. And there has to be a desire to do it. If we don't have any desire, we don't fabricate things. It's one of those truths of the will where it's not going to happen unless you want it to happen. Wherever there's a desire, there's going to be becoming. And becoming involves a sense of self. What the path needs is a skillful sense of self. The Buddha talks about this quite a bit. The self is its own mainstay. In other words, you have to depend on yourself. If you don't depend on yourself, who are you going to depend on? Who can do the work for you? It's not the case that someone is going to come and save us from ourselves. We have to figure out for ourselves where we're lacking skill. That's one of the definitions of avidya. The cause of suffering is a lack of skill. We're being unskillful, so what are we going to do to get past it? We have to depend on ourselves. Nobody can give us a skill. We have to learn it ourselves. So as with any desire, there's going to be your sense of self as a producer and the self as a consumer. The producer is the one who can do this. The consumer is the one who's going to enjoy the results. As for the self as the producer, we have to have the confidence that we can do this. This comes in Ven. Ananda's discussion of how we need conceit in order to get past conceit. The conceit that other people can do this. They're human beings. I'm a human being. Why can't I? That's a good sense of self. You need that. You need to have that kind of confidence. Otherwise, you can't do the path. You may think that Nibbana is off someplace else. A lot of us here think that Nibbana is over in Thailand. Ajahn Fuang once told me that when he was a little kid he thought Nibbana was up in the Himalayan mountains. And you can imagine what the people in the Himalayan mountains think. Someplace else. Actually, Nibbana is something we can attain through our efforts right here. Someone once asked me, where's the best place to practice? And I said, right where you are. This is where things are going to be found. So you've got to have the confidence that it's here, and you're capable of finding it, which is how conceit is needed on the path. You can't let go of healthy conceit right away. You have to keep believing that you're capable of this. And then there's the self as a consumer. There's the passage where the Buddha talks about the self as a governing principle. He's got 3 governing principles for ways to think when you're feeling tempted to leave the path. 1 is the world as a governing principle. Realizing that there are beings in the world who can read your mind. What are they going to think when you're getting ready to give up? Then there's the Dhamma as a governing principle. Realizing that here's an excellent Dhamma. It's very rare that we find a true Dhamma like this. So here's our chance to practice. If we don't practice now, when are we going to get another chance? Then there's self as a governing principle, which is where you remind yourself, I got on this path because I wanted to put an end to suffering. If I get off this path or if I stop and get lazy and lax, do I really love myself? In this case, you're thinking about yourself as the consumer of the results of the path. It's something you want to hold in mind. Don't be afraid of having a desire to practice. Don't be afraid of building up a self around it. I once read a book by a monk saying that concentration and effort require a strong sense of will and motivation, but motivation requires a sense of self, and we all know that Buddhism is against a sense of self, so right concentration is not to try to do concentration. And right effort is not to do any effort, which is getting everything all backwards. You use the sense of self, a healthy sense of self, until you don't need it anymore. Then you naturally drop it. Even the beginning of wisdom starts with a question framed in terms of self. What, when I do it, will be for my long-term welfare and happiness? There you've got the self both as a producer and as a consumer built right into the question. What makes it wise is that you realize that there is such a thing as long-term happiness. You want long-term rather than short-term, and you realize it's going to have to depend on your actions. So where do you try to find an answer to that question? You look at your own actions. Where are you causing suffering? Can you stop? Can you be more skillful in your actions? When you're doing concentration, it's the same sort of thing. When the mind gets settled down, is it really as still as it could be? Or is there some disturbance in here? Look around to see what you're doing that's causing the disturbance, because the acts of the mind are what's causing the disturbance. The Buddha devotes a refrain in a sutta to the need to settle in and indulge in concentration, which means you let yourself enjoy it for a while. Don't be afraid of enjoying the concentration. Don't listen to those people who plaster warning signs all over jhana saying, watch out. Keep away. Dangerous. The Buddha never put warning signs on jhana. He never cordoned it off. He said that this is something you should want to do. If you're going to be attached to the pleasure, it's better than not having this pleasure to be attached to, because otherwise, you're just going to go back to your old ways, attached to looking for pleasure in sensuality. So you learn how to enjoy the pleasure of concentration, but without losing your focus. This is one of the practices you do in order not to be overcome by pleasure or overcome by pain. Whatever little pains there are in the body, you learn to work through them. As for the pleasure, you don't let the pleasure absorb all of your attention. When you're with the breath, you don't leave the breath. It's a matter of learning how to be with pleasure, sometimes very intense pleasure, and yet not focus on the pleasure itself. Keep your eye on the breath. Stay with the breath. It's like that image the Buddha gives of the man walking through a crowd. He's got a bowl of oil on his head and someone following right behind him with a sword raised. If a drop of oil falls from the bowl, the man with the sword is going to cut off the guy's head. On one side, there's a beauty queen, singing and dancing. On the other side, there's a huge crowd exclaiming, the beauty queen is singing. The beauty queen is dancing. And if he lets himself get distracted by either side, he's going to die. The same thing happens if you let your attention stray from the breath to the pleasure. It's not that you're going to die if you start wallowing in the pleasure, your concentration will die. You'll lose your focus, and your concentration will become less and less alert. Sometimes you'll sit here for a while in a nice hazy buzz, but when you come out, you won't have any sense of where you were. That's concentration lacking alertness. Delusion concentration. So you learn how to be with the pleasure, but not overcome by the pleasure. Then you can ask yourself, is this as still as it could be? Or is there something in here that's still a disturbance to the mind? You look for that. You see what you're doing, what perception you're holding in mind. As you abandon any perceptions that create even the slightest disturbance, you go into deeper, and deeper stages of concentration. Basically, what you're doing is asking yourself the questions of the Four Noble Truths. Where's the suffering? Where's the stress? In this case, it's very subtle. It's hard to call it suffering, but it is stress. It is a disturbance. When you notice it, the next questions are: what action is causing it? And what can you do to let it go? If you keep up this process, you finally do get to something in the mind that's deeper than concentration. You can actually touch the deathless inside. And because you've gotten used to seeing how the mind fabricates states, you recognize this as something not fabricated. You know you didn't do it. But the fabrication of the path got you to the threshold. After having that experience, you come out of it. And in coming out of it, that's where the fetters get cut. The very first time around, you've gained certainty. You're no longer uncertain about what the Buddha taught. You've experienced what he taught. As he said, there really is a deathless, and you found it. There's no longer any holding on to teachings about the self, because however you could define a self would have to be around the five aggregates, and you've now had that experience that had nothing to do with the five aggregates at all. There's not even any desire to want to define yourself in any way, as a separate self or a connected self or a finite self or an infinite self, cosmic self, whatever. There's no desire to define yourself in any way, shape, or form. Finally, there's no longer any clinging to precepts or habits and practices. In other words, your virtue is mastered. What does it mean not to cling to virtue? It doesn't mean you don't hold to the precepts anymore. It's just that the precepts are part of your behavior now, and you don't have to build any sense of self around them. There's no fashioning of a sense of self, so you're not silamaya. You're not fashioned of your precepts. In other words, you're virtuous, but there's no sense that you're better than other people because you're virtuous. You're not defining yourself in terms of your virtue. But you're still holding on to the practice of concentration and discernment because you've got to develop them further. That's where a lingering sense of self remains and where it's still needed. There still has to be a little bit of conceit around these practices, otherwise they're not going to get mastered. It's not the case that we can make up our minds, saying, okay, I'm going to abandon this fetter today, and then work on the next fetter tomorrow. You can't plan these things in advance. Instead, as the Ajahn say, you're cooking the mind. As in Ajahn Lee's image, you're putting a piece of rock in a smelter. As the heat gets higher, the different metals in the rock begin to melt and come flowing out of the rock. First there's the tin, then there's the lead, then there's the zinc, then there's the silver, then there's the gold, as the heat gets higher and higher. You can't pick these things out of the rock with a toothpick or a scalpel. The only thing you can do is put the heat of your effort on the mind, keeping after the mind when it's causing any sense of stress or suffering or disturbance. You want to figure out what's going on. That's the heat. Ajahn Lee calls it the heat of ardency, the wisdom factor in mindfulness and concentration practice. And through that heat, the good things start showing themselves. So the way we test the Buddha's teachings is right here in getting our mind into concentration, and then asking the right questions. As for the things that get abandoned, they get abandoned based on experiences that will come when you subject the mind to the right practice. So focus on the causes, and the results will take care of themselves. The path is something fabricated. It leads to something unfabricated. It doesn't cause the unfabricated, but it leads you there. Without the path, you can't get there at all. So focus on what you're doing right now. Be really sensitive to what you're doing right now. Because your sensitivity is what's going to allow you to see where there's stress that you didn't notice before, along with what's coming along with the stress, what's causing it. This is discernment. Discernment is not just a matter of repeating a formula, like inconstant, stressful, not self. It's a matter of learning to be more and more sensitive to what you're doing and the results of what you're doing. As you get more and more sensitive, things will start showing up that you didn't see before. And in that direct experience, the results will come on their own without your having to know about them beforehand. In harmony with the teachings of the Buddha, we emphasize the profound importance of sharing wisdom far and wide. Presently, we've made this extensive 1,000-page work accessible through audio format. The responsibility to further this noble cause now rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the broad dissemination of these teachings, which can benefit numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.